Bullies trip him, they didn't know. He's a JIU-JITSU champion, just holding back. Marcus Rivera stood barely 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighed maybe 130 pounds soaking wet. At 17 years old, he looked more like a freshman than a junior, with his quiet demeanor and tendency to keep his head down in the hallways of Westfield High School. His dark hair, which he kept slightly longer than fashionable, fell across his forehead in a way that partially obscured his brown eyes, eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing absolutely nothing. The way he moved through the crowded corridors, sliding between groups of chattering students without making contact, suggested someone who had learned to make himself invisible. Most students didn't even know his name, despite him having transferred to Westfield 3 months ago at the beginning of the school year. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know from looking at his unremarkable exterior, was that Marcus Rivera had spent the last 8 years of his life training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu under the relentless tutelage of his father, Roberto the Snake Rivera, a former UFC fighter who had retired at the height of his career after a devastating knee injury. What they couldn't see beneath his oversized hoodies and baggy jeans was a body carved from thousands of hours of grappling, submission training and conditioning work that would make most athletes weep. The loose clothing wasn't a fashion statement or an attempt to hide insecurity. It was camouflage, hiding the coiled strength of someone who had been rolling on mats since he was 9 years old. What they couldn't understand was that Marcus chose silence not from weakness, but from a philosophy of control that had been drilled into him alongside arm bars and triangle chokes. His father had taught him that true strength wasn't about displaying power, but about knowing when to use it. Every morning, Roberto would remind him, the loudest person in the room is rarely the most dangerous. The one you should fear is the quiet one who knows exactly what he's capable of. Just get through the day, Marcus told himself every morning as he walked through the glass double doors of Westfield High School. The building was a sprawling complex of red brick and modern glass additions, housing nearly 2,000 students from one of the wealthiest suburbs in the state. The parking lot was filled with BMWs, Audis, and the occasional Tesla, gifts from parents who measured love in horsepower and leather interiors. Marcus's 10-year-old Honda Civic, which he'd bought with money saved from teaching kids jiu-jitsu classes at his father's gym, looked out of place among the luxury vehicles. The school's interior was no less impressive, with polished marble floors, state-of-the-art science labs, and an athletic complex that rivaled some college facilities. Trophy cases lined the main hallway, celebrating decades of academic and athletic excellence. Westfield's football team had won state championships 3 years running. Their lacrosse team was nationally ranked, and their average SAT scores were among the highest in the region. It was a school where success was expected, where anything less than excellence was seen as failure, and where social hierarchies were as rigid as they were ruthless. Most of the students had known each other since elementary school, their parents belonging to the same country clubs, their families vacationing in the same Hampton beach houses. They moved through the halls in predetermined patterns, each group claiming their territory with the confidence of those who had never questioned their place in the world. Being the new kid already made Marcus an outsider, arriving 3 months into junior year when friend groups had long been solidified. But being quiet, small, and unwilling to engage in the complex social dance of high school made him something else entirely: a target. The first person to truly notice Marcus was, unfortunately, Kyle Brennan, a 6'2" linebacker who ruled the junior class through a combination of physical intimidation and social influence. Kyle had the kind of all-American good looks that college recruiters loved: thick blonde hair that he wore slightly long, broad shoulders that filled out his Letterman jacket perfectly, piercing blue eyes, and a square jaw that seemed designed for a toothpaste commercial. His father was a successful hedge fund manager who had played football at Yale. His mother, a former Miss Connecticut, who now ran charity galas that raised 6 figures for causes she couldn't quite articulate. Kyle had been groomed for success since birth, attending the right camps, playing the right sports, dating the right girls. His smile was practiced and cold, the kind that never quite reached his eyes that were constantly scanning for weakness, for opportunity, for anyone who might challenge his position at the top of Westfield's social food chain. Kyle had learned early that in the ecosystem of high school, you were either predator or prey, and he had no intention of being anything other than the apex predator. Kyle's 2 constant companions were Jake Morrison and Tommy Chen, each serving a specific role in his carefully constructed social empire. Jake was a stocky wrestler with the build of a pit bull, short, muscular, and bred for violence. His neck was almost as wide as his head, the result of years of bridge exercises and steroid cycles that everyone suspected but no one reported. Jake's father owned a construction company and had taught his son that the world was divided into 2 categories, those who took what they wanted and those who got taken from. Jake had dead eyes that reflected neither humor nor empathy, just a constant readiness for violence that made even teachers uncomfortable. Tommy Chen was different, tall and lanky with the build of a basketball player, which he was, starting point guard for the varsity team despite being only a junior. Tommy was the son of first-generation immigrants who had built a chain of successful restaurants, and he carried the weight of their expectations on his narrow shoulders. He was smart enough to know that following Kyle was wrong, but too invested in his social standing to risk challenging him. Tommy provided Kyle with a veneer of diversity and athletic credibility beyond football, and in return, Kyle ensured Tommy's acceptance in circles that might otherwise have remained closed to him. The harassment started small, so small that Marcus almost wondered if he was imagining it. A shoulder check in the hallway that could have been accidental. "Watch where you're going, freshman," Kyle had said, with that practiced smile, even though he knew Marcus was a junior. The use of freshman was deliberate, a verbal diminishment that positioned Marcus as lesser, younger, weaker. Then came the snickers when Marcus walked by their table in the cafeteria. Whispered comments just loud enough for him to hear, but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability. "Look at him," Kyle would say to his audience of admirers, "walking around like a ghost. What do you think he's hiding under those baggy clothes? My little sister has more muscle than that kid." The laughter that followed was always too loud, performative, designed to draw attention to Marcus's supposed inadequacies. Girls would glance over with a mixture of pity and second-hand embarrassment, while other guys would join in the laughter, grateful that they weren't the target. Marcus absorbed it all without visible reaction, his face maintaining a mask of indifference that only seemed to frustrate Kyle more. Inside, Marcus was running through breathing exercises his father had taught him, the same ones he used before competitions. In through the nose for 4 counts, hold for 4, out through the mouth for 4. Control the breath, control the mind, control the body. "What's wrong with this kid?" Kyle muttered to Jake one day after Marcus had walked past their group without acknowledging their existence for the 5th time that week. They had called him Mouse Boy loud enough for half the hallway to hear. And Marcus hadn't even broken stride. It's like he's deaf or something. Or maybe he's just too stupid to understand when he's being insulted. Jake cracked his knuckles, a habit that served as both fidget and threat. Maybe he needs a more direct message. Some people are slow learners. "If only you knew," Marcus thought as he continued walking, his enhanced hearing sharpened by years of training to detect the subtle shifts that telegraphed an opponent's intentions, picking up every word of their conversation. His father had taught him that the strongest fighters chose their battles with the wisdom of generals, not the impulse of soldiers. "A true warrior doesn't fight to prove himself," Roberto would say during their morning training sessions, sweat dripping onto the mats as he demonstrated another variation of a rear naked choke. He fights only when fighting is the only option left. Everything else is just ego, and ego gets you submitted. So Marcus endured. He endured having his backpack knocked off his shoulder in crowded hallways, the contents spilling across the floor while students stepped over his scattered belongings without offering help. He endured finding his locker decorated with sticky notes bearing increasingly creative insults: freak, weirdo, ghost boy, and worse. Someone had drawn a crude picture of a mouse wearing glasses, labeled Marcus the Mouse in permanent marker that took the janitor 20 minutes to remove. He endured Kyle's group blocking his path to the library, forcing him to take the long way around through the music wing where the orchestra kids practiced. The detour added 10 minutes to his journey and often made him late for his study period. But explaining why would mean acknowledging the bullying, and acknowledging it would mean admitting he couldn't handle it on his own. The incidents escalated with calculated precision. Kyle was smart enough to keep his hands technically clean, orchestrating harassment that could be dismissed as pranks or accidents. In the cafeteria, Jake would time his movements perfectly, accidentally bumping into Marcus just as he picked up his lunch tray, sending food cascading onto the floor. The cafeteria workers, underpaid and overworked, would sigh and hand him napkins without sympathy. "You need to be more careful," one had said, as if Marcus had chosen to wear his lunch rather than eat it. In gym class, where Marcus had deliberately underperformed to avoid attention, Tommy would throw basketballs with unnecessary force during warm-ups, aiming for Marcus's head with the precision of someone who had spent years perfecting his aim. When Marcus dodged or deflected them, instincts honed from years of training making it impossible not to react, Tommy would shrug innocently. "Sorry, man, you should have called for it." Coach Williams, a former Marine who believed that bullying built character, would barely glance up from his clipboard. "Rivera, stop standing around and get in the game," he'd bark, as if Marcus was the problem rather than the target. Kyle orchestrated it all with the calculated cruelty of someone who had learned that power wasn't just about physical strength, but about psychological dominance. He understood instinctively that the fear of violence was often more effective than violence itself, that the anticipation of humiliation cut deeper than the act. One day during lunch, Kyle was holding court at his usual table, surrounded by teammates and cheerleaders who laughed at his every joke and validated his every opinion. His girlfriend, Sarah Chen, Tommy's cousin, ironically, sat beside him, her perfectly manicured nails drumming against the table as Kyle regaled the group with another story about the mouse. "He doesn't even fight back," Kyle complained, his voice carrying across the cafeteria with practice projection. Yesterday, Jake knocked his books out of his hands, and the kid just picked them up like nothing happened. What kind of guy just takes it? Sarah frowned, pushing her salad around with her fork. She was beautiful in that carefully cultivated way that required hours of maintenance, highlighted hair that cost more than some people's rent, subtle makeup that looked natural but took 45 minutes to apply, and clothes that whispered rather than screamed their designer labels. But there was intelligence in her eyes, and occasionally conscience. "Maybe you should just leave him alone, Kyle," she suggested quietly. "He's not bothering anyone." The table went silent. Kyle's eyes flashed with something dangerous, the smile never leaving his face but hardening into something that made Sarah lean back slightly. "That's the problem, babe," Kyle said, his voice taking on an edge that made several people at the table shift uncomfortably. "He acts like he's above it all, like he's better than us, walking around here like he owns the place, ignoring everyone, thinking he's too good to even respond when someone talks to him. Someone needs to teach him where he stands in the food chain." Marcus heard this entire exchange from 2 tables away, his enhanced hearing picking up every word, despite the ambient noise of hundreds of teenagers eating and talking. He felt his jaw clench involuntarily, then forced himself to relax, rotating his neck slightly to release the tension. The tempura roll he was eating suddenly tasted like cardboard, but he continued chewing methodically, showing no outward sign that he'd heard anything. Control, he reminded himself, the word becoming a mantra. Always control. His father had made him hold submission positions for minutes at a time, not to hurt his training partners, but to learn the discipline of restraint. Anyone can break an arm, Roberto would say. It takes a true artist to hold someone at the edge of breaking and choose not to cross that line. But control became harder as the weeks passed, each incident adding weight to a burden that was becoming increasingly difficult to carry. The bullying moved beyond the school grounds when Kyle's group started following him home, their cars crawling beside him as he walked, windows down, voices calling out insults that echoed off the suburban houses. "Hey, mouse boy! Why don't you scurry home a little faster?" They would rev their engines, tires screeching as they peeled away, leaving Marcus standing on the sidewalk with his fists clenched inside his pockets. They discovered his social media accounts, the few he maintained, and created fake profiles to flood his posts with embarrassing memes and photoshopped images. Someone had taken a photo of him in the hallway and superimposed mouse ears and whiskers on it, circulating it through group chats and Instagram stories. They spread rumors with the creativity of fiction writers that he was mute, that he was on medication for psychological issues, that his family was involved in drugs, that he'd been expelled from his previous school for bringing a weapon. The rumors mutated and spread like viruses, each retelling adding new details until Marcus became a figure of myth rather than reality. Teachers began looking at him differently, their expressions a mixture of pity and wariness. Even students who had never interacted with him began to avoid him, as if his unpopularity might be contagious. Mrs. Patterson, his AP chemistry teacher who had initially praised his lab work, now seemed to look through him during class. When Kyle would make snide comments, "Maybe Marcus can't answer because mice can't talk," she would simply continue with her lecture, as if she hadn't heard. The message was clear. Marcus was on his own. Coach Williams actively participated in the ostracization, making Marcus the perpetual example of what not to do during gym class. Rivera here demonstrates the importance of spatial awareness, he'd say, after another accident left Marcus sprawled on the gymnasium floor. The other students would laugh nervously, grateful they weren't the ones being singled out. Even Principal Hayes, who prided himself on running a zero-tolerance school when it came to bullying, seemed to develop selective blindness when it came to Marcus's situation. During one particularly egregious incident, where Kyle had accidentally spilled an entire bottle of Gatorade on Marcus's backpack, Principal Hayes had walked by, observed the scene, and simply nodded before continuing to his office. The message couldn't have been clearer. Some students mattered more than others. Marcus understood the dynamics at play with crystalline clarity. Kyle's father donated substantial amounts to the school's athletic program, his name emblazoned on a plaque outside the new weight room. Kyle was being recruited by several Division I schools, his future seemingly predetermined and golden. Marcus was just some transfer student with no connections, no athletic prowess that anyone could see, and no social capital to spend. They're all part of the same system, Marcus realized during a particularly dark moment, sitting alone in his car after school, watching Kyle and his friends pile into Jake's lifted truck, laughing about something that had happened during last period. The system protected those who fed it and discarded those who didn't. It was nature's oldest law dressed up in the trappings of civilization. His father noticed the change in him during their evening training sessions. Marcus's movements became sharper, more aggressive. His submissions held a fraction of a second longer than necessary. During one sparring session with a training partner, Marcus had cranked an armbar with enough force to make the other man tap frantically. "You're fighting angry," Roberto observed afterward, handing Marcus a water bottle. Anger makes you strong but stupid. It makes you predictable. I'm fine, Marcus insisted, but his father's knowing look said he wasn't fooled. Whatever's happening at school, remember, violence is always the last option, not the first. But when it becomes necessary. Roberto paused, his own history of professional violence adding weight to his words. When it becomes necessary, you end it decisively. No hesitation, no half measures. You protect yourself completely. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in late October, the autumn air crisp with the promise of winter, leaves crunching underfoot as students moved between buildings. Marcus was walking to his AP chemistry class, his mind focused on the upcoming test on molecular bonds, when he saw Kyle's group positioned strategically near the main stairwell. It was an ambush, planned with military precision. Kyle leaned against the wall with studied casualness, his letterman jacket arranged to display his varsity letters, that practiced smile playing on his lips like a threat. Jake stood to his left, cracking his knuckles in that menacing rhythm, while Tommy flanked the right side of the hallway, cutting off any escape route. Other students sensed the tension and began to slow their pace, some pulling out phones in anticipation of whatever was about to happen. Marcus considered his options. In the split second he had to decide. He could turn around, but that would mean being late for the chemistry test, and Mrs. Patterson had made it clear that tardiness would result in a 0. He could try to push through, but that would likely escalate the situation. Or he could do what he'd been doing for months, endure whatever they had planned, and continue with his day. Just walk past them, he told himself, adjusting his backpack and maintaining his steady pace. As Marcus approached, Kyle pushed off from the wall with theatrical timing, stepping directly into Marcus's path. The hallway, which had been filled with the usual chaos of students changing classes, suddenly seemed to quiet, as if everyone collectively held their breath. "Hey there, mouse boy," Kyle said loudly, his voice pitched to carry to the growing audience. "How's your day going?" squeaking along as usual. The laughter that followed was nervous but present, students eager to align themselves with the perceived victor in this confrontation. Marcus kept his eyes forward, his peripheral vision taking in the positions of all three antagonists, his body automatically calculating angles and distances, habits drilled into him through years of training. He tried to step around Kyle, but Jake moved to block his path, a wall of muscle in a wrestling team hoodie. "Kyle asked you a question, freak," Jake growled, his voice low and threatening. "It's rude not to answer when someone's talking to you." "I'm fine," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to flood his system. "Excuse me, I need to get to class." Kyle's grin widened, sensing blood in the water. "Oh, he can talk, guys. The mouse can actually talk. I was beginning to think we had a mute on our hands." Several students had stopped completely now, forming a loose circle around the confrontation. Phones appeared like weapons, ready to record whatever humiliation was about to unfold. Marcus felt the weight of their attention, the hungry anticipation for drama, for someone else's pain to become their entertainment. "What's the matter, Rivera?" Tommy chimed in, stepping closer from the right. "Cat got your tongue? Or are you just too scared to have a real conversation?" The space around Marcus was shrinking, the three boys forming a triangle with him at the center. His breathing remained steady, controlled, even as his muscles began to coil with readiness. He could see at least 12 different ways to escape or neutralize the situation, techniques and combinations flowing through his mind like a familiar song. But still, he held back. Marcus tried once more to step around them, but Kyle moved directly in front of him, close enough that Marcus could smell his expensive cologne mixed with the protein shake he'd had for lunch. "I don't think we're done talking yet," Kyle said, his voice dropping to a more menacing register. "You've been ignoring us for weeks, walking around here like you're some kind of ghost. Well, guess what? Ghosts aren't real, and neither is your little tough guy act. I just want to get to class, Marcus replied steadily, meeting Kyle's eyes for a brief moment, long enough to see the cruelty there, the enjoyment of causing pain. Kyle pretended to consider this, making a show of checking his designer watch. Class, huh? Well, maybe you should have thought about that before being such a stuck-up little weirdo. Maybe if you learned how to interact with people like a normal human being, we wouldn't have to have these little chats. What happened next occurred in slow motion, each detail crystallizing in Marcus's memory with perfect clarity. Kyle nodded almost imperceptibly to Jake, who was positioned behind Marcus, a signal they had clearly used before. Jake's foot shot out in a perfectly timed leg sweep, catching Marcus's ankle just as he shifted his weight to step forward. Marcus felt himself falling, his books scattering from his arms as gravity took hold. The crowd gasped, some laughing preemptively, anticipating the humiliation of seeing him sprawled on the floor. But even as he fell, 8 years of training took over. His body twisted mid-air with the fluid grace of a gymnast, his hands shooting out to break his fall while his core engaged to protect his spine. He hit the ground hard but controlled, immediately rolling to absorb the impact, a breakfall technique he'd practiced thousands of times on gym mats. To the observers, it might have looked like a clumsy tumble, but Marcus had turned what could have been a painful faceplant into a controlled descent. Around him, students burst into laughter, the sound echoing off the walls like thunder. Kyle's voice rose above the rest, performative and cruel. Oops, guess the mouse isn't very coordinated. Maybe you should watch where you're going, Rivera. These halls can be dangerous for someone who doesn't pay attention. Marcus lay there for a moment, surrounded by his scattered belongings and the sound of mocking laughter. His chemistry notebook was crumpled, pages torn from the spiral binding. His textbook lay with its spine bent at an unnatural angle, probably damaged beyond repair. His calculator had skittered across the floor, coming to rest against someone's designer boots, someone who made no move to pick it up. But what hurt most wasn't the physical impact, though his shoulder would certainly bruise. It was the response of the crowd, the eager consumption of his humiliation. He saw Sarah Chen cover her mouth, but whether in shock or to hide laughter, he couldn't tell. He saw students pulling out phones, recording his prone form for posterity, for Instagram stories and Snapchat streaks. He saw teachers at the far end of the hallway, deliberately looking away, choosing not to see what was happening. It was the realization that to them, to all of them, he wasn't human. He was entertainment, a brief distraction from their own carefully curated lives. His pain was their amusement, his humiliation their social currency. Something snapped inside Marcus Rivera. Not broke, snapped into place, like a dislocated joint finally sliding back where it belonged. Marcus rose from the floor with a fluid grace that caught several students off guard. There was something different in the way he moved now, no longer the careful, deliberately small movements of someone trying to remain invisible, but the controlled, economical motions of someone who understood their body's capabilities intimately. He dusted off his jeans with deliberate casualness, then began collecting his belongings with methodical precision. That was pretty clumsy, mouse boy, Kyle continued, still performing for his audience, drunk on the power of the moment. Maybe you should watch where you're... My name, Marcus said, his voice cutting through Kyle's words like a blade through silk, is Marcus Rivera. The laughter died instantly, as if someone had pulled the plug on a speaker system. There was something in Marcus's tone, not loud, not aggressive, but carrying an edge that made everyone lean in slightly, suddenly aware that the dynamic had shifted in some indefinable way. Marcus straightened fully, his backpack in one hand, and for the first time in 3 months, he looked directly at Kyle Brennan. What Kyle saw in those brown eyes made him take an involuntary step backward. It wasn't rage or fear or any emotion Kyle was familiar with. It was the calm, calculating gaze of someone who had made a decision and was entirely at peace with the consequences. "I don't care what your name is, freak," Kyle said, but his voice had lost some of its swagger, uncertain in the face of this unexpected development. "You're still a... tomorrow," Marcus interrupted, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent hallway. "After school, the empty parking lot behind the gym." Kyle blinked, certain he had misheard. "What?" "You want to finish this?" Marcus asked, shouldering his backpack with movements that somehow seemed dangerous, loaded with potential energy. "Then let's finish it. Just you and me. No ambushes, no leg sweeps, no audience, unless you're afraid to face me without your backup." Jake laughed nervously, the sound hollow in the quiet hallway. "Is the little mouse trying to sound tough? Did you hit your head when you fell?" Marcus's gaze shifted to Jake, and the wrestler felt an unexpected chill run down his spine. There was something predatory in that look, something that triggered primitive alarm bells in Jake's hindbrain. "If you want to make it 2-on-1, that's your choice," Marcus said calmly. "But know that I won't hold back anymore." The word "anymore" hung in the air like a threat, implying capabilities that had been deliberately restrained, power that had been consciously contained. It reframed every interaction they'd had, suggesting that Marcus's passivity hadn't been weakness, but choice. Kyle's face flushed red, trapped between his reputation and an uncertainty he'd never felt before. The crowd was watching, waiting to see how their golden boy would respond to this unprecedented challenge from someone who, until moments ago, had been nothing more than a victim. "You're crazy if you think I'm wasting my time fighting some scrawny transfer student," Kyle said, trying to regain his footing, to re-establish the social hierarchy that had just been called into question. "Then stop bothering me," Marcus said simply. "Your choice. Either we settle this tomorrow or you leave me alone. Permanently." He turned and walked away, leaving Kyle standing with his mouth open and his friends looking uncertain for the first time since Marcus had arrived at Westfield. The crowd parted before Marcus like water, students stepping aside with a mixture of shock and newfound respect. As Marcus walked, he heard the whispers starting behind him, spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Did he just challenge Kyle Brennan? The mouse wants to fight? He's going to get destroyed. I don't know, did you see his eyes? This is insane. Word spread through Westfield High School with the speed of scandal. Within an hour, everyone knew that Marcus Rivera, quiet, weird Marcus Rivera, who no one really knew anything about, had challenged Kyle Brennan to a fight. The school's social media channels exploded with speculation and anticipation. Some students were excited to see Kyle finally face someone who wasn't afraid of him. Others were already planning angles for recording the inevitable beatdown. Betting pools formed in bathroom stalls and locker rooms, with odds heavily favoring Kyle. Marcus spent the rest of the day in a strange bubble of attention. Students who had never acknowledged his existence suddenly wanted to talk to him. A group of freshmen who had been Kyle's previous targets looked at him with something approaching hero worship. Even some of the teachers seemed to regard him differently, though whether with concern or curiosity he couldn't tell. "Are you really going to fight him?" David Kim, a sophomore from Marcus's calculus class, asked during last period. Marcus looked up from his equations. "If he shows up. But Kyle's on the wrestling team, and he's huge, and he has Jake and Tommy." "I know," Marcus replied, returning to his work. "Aren't you scared?" Marcus considered the question. Fear was something he'd been taught to understand and manage, not eliminate. Fear kept you sharp, kept you aware. But the fear of physical confrontation had been trained out of him through thousands of hours on the mats, replaced with a healthy respect for violence and its consequences. "No," he said finally, "I'm not scared of Kyle Brennan." That evening, Marcus drove home to find his father's truck already in the driveway. The house was modest compared to the McMansions that dominated Westfield's landscape. A two-story colonial with cedar siding and a two-car garage that had been converted into a training space. Inside that garage was everything Marcus had grown up with: professional-grade mats, heavy bags, a speed bag, pull-up bars, and walls lined with medals and photographs from his father's fighting career. Roberto Rivera was sitting at the kitchen table, reviewing paperwork from his gym, when Marcus walked in. At 43, Roberto still moved with the fluid grace of a fighter, though his left knee, the one that had ended his career, occasionally betrayed him with a slight limp. His face bore the subtle marks of his profession: a nose that had been broken and reset multiple times, scar tissue around his eyebrows, cauliflower ears that he wore like badges of honor. But his eyes were sharp and intelligent, the eyes of someone who had learned to read opponents like books. "Something happened today," Roberto observed, not looking up from his papers. It wasn't a question. Marcus set down his backpack and sat across from his father. "I challenged someone to a fight." Roberto's pen stopped moving. He looked up, studying his son's face with the intensity of a coach evaluating a fighter. "Tell me." Marcus explained everything: the months of harassment, the escalation, the incident at the stairwell, his challenge to Kyle. He left nothing out, including his own emotional journey from endurance to decision. Roberto listened without interrupting, his expression neutral. When Marcus finished, Roberto leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled under his chin. "And tomorrow? What's your plan?" "That depends on him," Marcus replied. "If he comes alone and wants to fight, I'll defend myself. If he brings his friends, I'll defend myself. If he tries to turn it into something more than a fight..." Marcus paused. "I'll end it." Roberto nodded slowly. "You've been patient, more patient than I would have been at your age. But patience without purpose is just suffering. You gave them every opportunity to leave you alone, and they chose escalation. Now you choose response. Just remember, once you show them what you can do, there's no going back. The quiet kid disappears forever." "Good," Marcus said, surprising himself with the vehemence in his voice. "I'm tired of being invisible. I'm tired of being everyone's entertainment. I'm tired of teachers looking the other way and students treating me like I'm not human." Roberto smiled slightly, an expression that would have been familiar to anyone who had watched his fights. "Then tomorrow, you remind them that you are. But Marcus, remember what I've always taught you. We don't fight to hurt people. We fight to stop them from hurting us. There's a difference between justice and revenge." "I know, Dad." "Do you? Because once the adrenaline hits, once you have Kyle Brennan in a submission hold with his arm about to break, will you remember? Will you be able to stop yourself when every instinct is screaming to make him pay for every humiliation?" Marcus met his father's eyes steadily. "Yes, because I'm not like him. I don't need to break someone to prove I'm strong." Roberto stood and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Then let's go train. If you're going to do this, you're going to do it right." They spent 2 hours in the garage, not working on new techniques. Marcus knew more than enough to handle a high school bully. But on control, on precision, on the mental aspects of combat. Roberto had Marcus flow through sequences of moves, chaining submissions together in fluid combinations. They worked on de-escalation techniques, on reading body language, on managing multiple opponents. "Remember," Roberto said as they finished, both of them sweating despite the cool October evening, "most people who think they can fight have never really fought. They've thrown punches at heavy bags or wrestled with friends, but they've never faced someone who understands violence as a science. Kyle Brennan thinks size and strength equal victory. Tomorrow, you teach him otherwise." "What if he doesn't show up?" Marcus asked, toweling off. "Then you've won, without throwing a punch. But from what you've told me about his ego, he'll be there. His reputation depends on it." That night, Marcus lay in bed replaying scenarios in his mind, not the fight itself. He'd visualized combat situations so many times they were almost boring. But the aftermath. How would the school react? Would Kyle's harassment end, or would it escalate? Would other bullies see him as a threat or a challenge? He thought about his life before Westfield, at his previous school, where he'd been just another face in the crowd. The move had been necessary. Roberto's gym had expanded, and they'd needed to relocate to find affordable space in a better market. Marcus hadn't wanted to leave, but he'd understood. Family came first, always. But Westfield had been a culture shock from day one. The wealth, the entitlement, the casual cruelty disguised as tradition. He'd tried to fit in at first, but his second-hand clothes and quiet demeanor had immediately marked him as different. Then Kyle had noticed him, and different had become targeted. The next day at school carried an electric tension that everyone could feel. Students whispered in clusters, glancing at Marcus as he passed. Teachers seemed more alert, as if sensing the potential for violence in the air. Even the weather seemed to acknowledge the impending confrontation. Grey clouds gathering overhead, promising rain but withholding it, the air heavy with possibility. Kyle was notably subdued during the classes they shared. His usual bravado replaced with something harder to read. He didn't make eye contact with Marcus, didn't make his usual comments, didn't perform his typical dominance displays. Jake and Tommy flanked him like bodyguards, their expressions grim. Sarah Chen approached Marcus during lunch, catching him alone at his usual table in the corner of the cafeteria. "You don't have to do this," she said without preamble, sitting down across from him. Marcus looked up from his sandwich. "Do what?" "Fight Kyle. It's stupid and dangerous, and someone's going to get hurt." "Someone's been getting hurt for months," Marcus replied evenly. "You just didn't care because it was me." Sarah flinched at the truth in his words. "That's not... I tried to tell Kyle to leave you alone. Once. You suggested it once, quietly, and when he pushed back, you dropped it. How brave of you." "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" Marcus interrupted. "How many times did you watch him humiliate me? How many times did you laugh along with everyone else? How many times did you see me eating alone, walking alone, existing alone and think, that's not my problem?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, her perfectly manicured nails picking at a spot on the table. "You're right," she admitted finally. "I could have done more, should have done more. But Kyle, you don't understand what he's capable of." Marcus almost laughed. "I understand exactly what Kyle's capable of. The question is whether he understands what I'm capable of." "He's been training," Sarah said quickly. "Jake's been teaching him wrestling moves all day. They think you're just some weird kid who's lost his mind." "Let them think that," Marcus said, returning to his lunch. Sarah stood to leave, then paused. "Be careful, Marcus, please. Now you care about my well-being?" "I always cared," she said quietly. "I just cared about my social standing more. I'm not proud of it." After she left, Marcus sat alone with his thoughts. He appreciated her honesty, even if it came too late to matter. That was the problem with Westfield. Everyone knew what was right, but no one was willing to risk anything to do it. The final bell rang at 3:15 p.m., and by 3:30, nearly 50 students had gathered in the empty parking lot behind the gymnasium. The space was perfect for what was about to happen. Hidden from the main buildings by a row of evergreen trees, far enough from the street to avoid casual observation, large enough to give the combatants room to move. The asphalt was cracked in places, weeds pushing through like nature's rebellion against human order. Marcus arrived exactly on time, still wearing his usual outfit. Dark jeans, a grey hoodie, beat-up Converse sneakers. He'd considered changing into something more suitable for fighting, but decided against it. Let them see him as he was, not as what they expected. He walked to the center of the impromptu arena and waited, hands at his sides, breathing steady and controlled. His father's words echoed in his mind. Center yourself. Feel the ground beneath your feet. Let your breathing sync with your heartbeat. Be present. Be aware. Be ready. The crowd was buzzing with anticipation. Some students had even brought friends from other schools to witness what they were sure would be epic entertainment. Phones were out and ready, multiple angles being set up to capture every moment. Someone had started a Facebook live stream. Kyle showed up 5 minutes later, fashionably late, with Jake and Tommy flanking him like generals accompanying their emperor to war. He'd changed into athletic shorts and a tank top that showed off his muscular physique, the product of years of weight training and probable supplement use. The size difference between him and Marcus was immediately apparent. Kyle had at least 6 inches and 40 pounds on Marcus, his reach advantage obvious even from a distance. Several girls in the crowd sighed appreciatively at Kyle's appearance. He was, Marcus had to admit, physically impressive in the way that American high school culture valued. Big, strong, traditionally handsome. Marcus looked like his little brother in comparison. "Last chance to apologize, freak," Kyle called out as he approached, his voice carrying that familiar arrogance but with an undercurrent of something else. Uncertainty, perhaps, or anticipation. "Say you're sorry for wasting everyone's time. Admit you're nothing but a weird little nobody, and maybe I'll go easy on you." Marcus looked around at the crowd, taking in their faces. He saw excitement, bloodlust, the hunger for violence that lurked beneath civilization's thin veneer. He saw students he recognized from classes who had never spoken to him but were now eager to watch him bleed. He saw teachers' cars in the distant parking lot, their owners deliberately absent. Then he looked back at Kyle, who had stopped about 10 feet away, bouncing on his toes like he'd seen fighters do in movies. "No," Marcus said simply. Kyle's face darkened with genuine anger now. "Fine. Have it your way." He rushed forward with the straightforward aggression that had intimidated smaller kids for years. The strategy, simple and brutally effective, use his size and strength to overwhelm, grab Marcus, throw him to the ground, and let his weight advantage do the rest. It was the same approach he'd used in every schoolyard fight since middle school, and it had never failed him. Marcus saw him coming with the clarity that came from thousands of hours of sparring. Time seemed to slow down, Kyle's movements telegraphed like a children's book. The way his right shoulder dipped slightly, indicating a grab rather than a punch. The way his feet positioned themselves for a takedown rather than striking. The way his eyes focused on Marcus's center mass rather than reading his whole body. As Kyle reached for him with both arms spread wide, planning to catch Marcus in a bear hug, Marcus moved. It was a simple sidestep, barely more than a shift of weight, but executed with perfect timing. Kyle's momentum carried him forward into empty air, his arms closing on nothing. In the same motion, Marcus's right hand shot out and grabbed Kyle's right wrist, while his left hand cupped Kyle's elbow. It was a basic arm drag, one of the first techniques Marcus had learned, but performed with such smooth efficiency that it looked like choreography. Marcus pulled on Kyle's wrist while pushing his elbow, using Kyle's own momentum against him. At the same time, he stepped behind Kyle and swept his right leg in a perfect Osoto Gari, a major outer reap that his father had drilled into him until it was as natural as breathing. Kyle's world suddenly inverted. One moment he was charging forward, confident in his strength and size. The next, his feet were leaving the ground, the grey sky spinning into view as his back rushed toward the unforgiving asphalt. The impact drove every ounce of air from his lungs in an explosive gasp that the entire crowd heard. His back hit first, then his head bounced off the pavement with a sound that made several watchers wince. The crowd gasped collectively, then fell silent. In less than 2 seconds, Kyle Brennan, the undisputed alpha of Westfield High's junior class, had gone from attacker to flat on his back, gasping for air like a beached fish. "What the hell?" Kyle wheezed, his diaphragm spasming as he struggled to breathe. The impact had knocked the wind out of him completely, leaving him temporarily helpless. Marcus stood over him, perfectly balanced, not even breathing hard. His hood had fallen back during the movement, revealing his face clearly for the first time. There was no anger there, no satisfaction, just calm focus. "Get up," Marcus said quietly. Kyle scrambled to his feet, his face red with a combination of oxygen deprivation and embarrassment. The crowd was murmuring now, uncertain. This wasn't following the script they'd expected. "You got lucky," Kyle gasped, trying to recover his composure. "You little—" He swung a wild haymaker at Marcus's head, putting all his strength and frustration behind it. It was a knockout punch, the kind that ended fights in movies and street brawls. If it connected, Marcus would be unconscious before he hit the ground. But Marcus saw it coming from the moment Kyle's shoulder began to rotate. He ducked under the punch smoothly, feeling the wind of it pass over his head. In the same motion, he stepped inside Kyle's guard, his arms wrapping around Kyle's waist in a wrestler's clinch. Before Kyle could process what was happening, Marcus had changed levels. Dropping his hips below Kyle's center of gravity, with explosive power that seemed impossible from someone his size, Marcus lifted Kyle off his feet. It was a textbook double-leg takedown, but executed with such violence that Kyle's feet went nearly vertical before Marcus drove him back down. This time, Marcus followed Kyle to the ground, maintaining control as they hit the asphalt. The watching students saw Kyle disappear beneath Marcus's compact frame, and suddenly they were witnessing something none of them had expected, a complete dismantling of everything Kyle Brennan represented. Marcus secured side control, his weight distributed perfectly across Kyle's torso. His right knee was tight against Kyle's hip, his left leg posted out for balance, his shoulder driving into Kyle's jaw to prevent him from turning. It was a position he'd held thousands of times in training, as comfortable as sitting in a chair. Kyle tried to push Marcus off with pure strength, his muscles straining, veins popping in his neck from the effort. But Marcus moved with his efforts, using Kyle's own force against him, flowing from position to position like water finding its way through rocks. "Let me up," Kyle grunted, his voice tight with growing panic. He'd never felt so helpless, so completely controlled. It was as if Marcus had turned into a human straitjacket, every movement Kyle made only tightening the control. "Are you going to leave me alone?" Marcus asked calmly, his voice carrying clearly to the watching crowd. "Screw you," Kyle spat, still defiant despite his disadvantage. Marcus transitioned smoothly to mount, sliding his knee across Kyle's body and settling his weight directly on Kyle's hips. It was the most dominant position in grappling, and Kyle instinctively knew he was in serious trouble. He bucked and thrashed like a wild animal, trying to throw Marcus off. But Marcus rode out every movement with the easy grace of someone who'd spent years perfecting his balance. Jake Morrison, watching his friend get dominated by someone half his size, decided he'd seen enough. "Get off him!" he shouted, rushing toward the fight with his wrestler's instincts taking over. Marcus saw him coming in his peripheral vision, his awareness extending beyond just his immediate opponent. Without releasing Kyle, Marcus shifted his weight subtly, preparing for what came next. As Jake tried to grab him from behind, Marcus pivoted on Kyle's body, using him as a base. His left hand shot out and caught Jake's reaching arm, redirecting his momentum while simultaneously sweeping Jake's lead leg with his own. Jake stumbled forward off balance, and Marcus pulled him down to the ground beside Kyle. In one fluid motion that would be replayed countless times on social media, Marcus transitioned from controlling one opponent to controlling two. He trapped Jake's head and arm in a triangle choke using his legs, while maintaining control of Kyle with his upper body. It was a position that shouldn't have been possible, something out of a martial arts movie, but Marcus made it look effortless. Now both bullies were trapped. Jake's face was already turning red as Marcus's legs constricted around his neck and arm, cutting off the blood flow to his brain. Kyle remained pinned beneath Marcus's upper body weight, unable to generate enough leverage to escape. "Holy crap!" someone in the crowd whispered, the words carrying in the stunned silence. "He's controlling both of them. Is this real? How is this possible? Jake's turning purple." Tommy Chen took a step forward, his basketball player's height giving him confidence, but he stopped when Marcus's gaze fixed on him. There was something in those brown eyes, not threat exactly, but promise. A clear message that there was room for one more if Tommy wanted to test his luck. Tommy, showing more wisdom than his friends, stayed where he was. Jake was beginning to make choking sounds, his free hand slapping desperately against Marcus's leg in the universal signal for submission. Marcus held the choke for another 2 seconds, long enough to make his point crystal clear, then released it. Jake rolled away immediately, gasping and coughing, his hands clutching his throat as he desperately sucked in air. Kyle had stopped struggling entirely, staring up at Marcus with a mixture of shock and growing fear. This wasn't supposed to happen. In Kyle's world, size and strength and social standing determined outcomes. The bigger dog won. The alpha dominated. But here he was, completely helpless beneath someone he'd dismissed as prey. "How are you doing this?" Kyle whispered, his voice carrying a note of genuine confusion. Marcus leaned down slightly, his voice conversational but loud enough for the nearest spectators to hear. 8 years of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, 4 years of Judo, 3 years of wrestling. My father is Roberto Rivera. Maybe you've heard of him? They called him the Snake in the UFC. He submitted 3 opponents in the first round during his title run. Several students immediately pulled out their phones, Googling the name. Within seconds, someone called out, "Holy shit, it's true!" His dad was a UFC champion. There are videos of him choking people unconscious. The revelation rippled through the crowd like an electric current. Marcus wasn't just some weird quiet kid. He was the son of a professional fighter, trained from childhood in one of the most effective martial arts ever developed. They'd been watching a sheep defend itself, only to discover it had been a wolf all along. Kyle's face had gone pale beneath Marcus's weight, the blood draining as the reality of his situation sank in. I didn't know." "Of course you didn't," Marcus said, his voice still calm but now carrying years of suppressed frustration. "You never bothered to know anything about me. You just saw someone quiet and small and decided I'd make an easy target. You never asked my name until yesterday. You never wondered why I never fought back. You never considered that maybe, just maybe, I was choosing not to hurt you." He leaned closer, his voice dropping so only Kyle could hear. "But here's what you're going to learn today. Being quiet doesn't mean being weak. Being small doesn't mean being helpless, and choosing not to fight doesn't mean being unable to fight." Marcus shifted his weight, applying more pressure to Kyle's chest. Not enough to hurt, but enough to emphasize his complete control. "Do you know how easy it would be to break your arm right now, to dislocate your shoulder, to choke you unconscious? I could do any of those things before anyone could stop me, but I won't. Do you know why?" Kyle shook his head minutely, afraid to speak. "Because I'm not you," Marcus said simply. "I don't need to hurt people to feel powerful. I don't need to humiliate others to feel important. That's the difference between us, Kyle. You're a bully because you're weak inside. I'm not a bully because I'm strong enough not to be." Marcus stood up smoothly, releasing Kyle entirely. The bigger boy scrambled backward on his hands and knees like a crab, putting distance between himself and Marcus, his eyes never leaving the smaller boy who had just revolutionized his understanding of the world. The crowd was completely silent, processing what they'd just witnessed. This wasn't how fights were supposed to go at Westfield High. The social hierarchy had just been shattered, the food chain inverted. Marcus addressed the crowd, his voice carrying clearly across the parking lot. "This is over. Anyone who has a problem with me can come talk to me like a human being. Anyone who thinks they can bully me or anyone else at this school." He looked directly at Jake, who was still coughing and holding his throat. "Well, you've seen what happens." He picked up his backpack from where he'd set it down and started walking toward the school building. The crowd parted before him like the Red Sea, students stepping aside with a mixture of awe and newfound respect. "Wait!" Kyle called out, his voice cracking. Marcus turned back, one eyebrow raised in question. Kyle struggled to his feet, his athletic clothes dirty and disheveled, his dignity in shambles around him. Students were still recording, still taking pictures, still Googling Marcus's father's fighting career. By tomorrow, everyone in the school district would know exactly what had happened here. Kyle Brennan's reign of terror had ended not with a bang, but with a submission. Kyle started, then stopped. He looked around at the crowd, at his friends who were avoiding his gaze, at the girls who were looking at him with something that might have been pity, at the younger students who were seeing him as mortal for the first time. "I'm sorry," he said finally, the words coming out in a rush, as if they'd been held back by a dam that had finally broken. "For everything, the tripping, the names, the rumors, all of it. You were just being a bully," Marcus said simply, his tone matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. "But you can choose to be something else. People can change, Kyle. The question is whether you want to." He turned and walked away, leaving Kyle standing in the parking lot, surrounded by the scattered pieces of his former reputation, the crown of his social kingdom lying broken on the asphalt. The changes at Westfield High School were immediate and dramatic. By the next morning, video clips of the fight had spread throughout not just the school, but the entire district. The footage was remarkable, clear, multiple angles, showing Marcus's complete domination of two larger opponents simultaneously. Social media exploded with discussions, memes, and analyses of what had happened. "Quiet kid turns out to be secret ninja" became a trending topic locally. Someone created a remix video set to music, Marcus's takedowns synchronized to the beat. The footage of him controlling both Kyle and Jake simultaneously became an instant viral sensation, shared thousands of times with captions like, "When the DLC character is overpowered," and "That moment when the tutorial boss realizes it's not the tutorial." Students who had never given Marcus a second glance were now approaching him with a mixture of respect, curiosity, and requests for self-defense lessons. The freshmen and sophomores who had been Kyle's previous victims looked at Marcus like he was some sort of avenging angel. Girls who had ignored his existence suddenly found him mysteriously attractive. The transformation was as swift as it was complete. But perhaps the most significant change was in Kyle himself. The humiliation of being dominated in front of half the school, and subsequently the entire internet, had shattered something fundamental in his worldview. For the first time in his life, Kyle Brennan understood what it felt like to be powerless, to be at someone else's mercy, to have your dignity stripped away while others watched and laughed. For 3 days, Kyle didn't come to school. Rumors swirled about his absence. Some said he was transferring, others that his parents were suing, still others that he was too embarrassed to show his face. Jake and Tommy attended classes but kept low profiles, their usual swagger completely absent. Jake had bruises on his neck from the choke, purple and yellow reminders of his humiliation that makeup couldn't quite hide. When Kyle finally returned, he was different. The armor of arrogance he'd worn like a second skin was gone, replaced by something more vulnerable, more human. He moved through the halls quietly, making eye contact with no one, experiencing for the first time what it was like to want to be invisible. During lunch that day, Kyle found Marcus eating alone in the library, a habit Marcus had maintained despite his newfound social options. "Can I sit?" Kyle asked quietly, his voice uncertain. Marcus looked up from his physics textbook, studying Kyle for a moment before gesturing to the empty chair across from him. Kyle sat down heavily, his usual confident posture replaced by something almost defeated. He was silent for a long moment, clearly struggling with what to say. "I wanted to thank you," he said finally. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Thank me. For not hurting me worse than you did. For not—" Kyle's voice cracked slightly. "For not breaking my arm or choking me out completely. For letting me keep some dignity, even though I didn't deserve it." "Everyone deserves dignity," Marcus replied simply. Kyle was quiet for another moment, his fingers drumming nervously on the table, a nervous habit Marcus had never seen from him before. "I've been thinking about what you said," Kyle continued, "about choosing to be something else. I talked to my parents about what I'd been doing, about what I'd become." He paused, swallowing hard. "My dad he was ashamed of me, said he didn't raise me to be a coward who picks on people weaker than me. My mom actually cried when she saw the videos and realized what kind of person her son had become. And my girlfriend, ex-girlfriend now, Sarah, broke up with me. Said she'd been embarrassed to be with me for months, but hadn't had the courage to say it. Said watching me torment you made her sick, but she was too worried about her own social standing to do anything about it." Marcus listened without commenting, letting Kyle work through his thoughts. "I also talked to my therapist," Kyle admitted, which surprised Marcus. He hadn't pictured Kyle as someone who would seek professional help. "She said I was a classic case of insecurity manifesting as aggression, that I bullied others because I was terrified of being seen as weak myself, that my whole identity was built on being physically superior, and when that was threatened—" He trailed off, then looked directly at Marcus for the first time. "I'm sorry. Really, genuinely sorry. Not just because you beat me, not just because everyone saw it, but because I finally understand what I put you through. The isolation, the humiliation, the constant fear. I did that to you and to others, and I can't undo it." "You're right," Marcus said evenly. "You can't undo it, but you can do better going forward." Kyle nodded eagerly. "I want to. I've already started. I found David Kim, you know, that sophomore I was messing with last year. I apologized to him, and Mark Chen from freshman year, and those kids from middle school." He paused. "There were a lot of people to apologize to. Some accepted it, some didn't. Some told me to go to hell, and honestly, they had every right to." "That's part of accountability," Marcus observed. "Living with the consequences of your actions, even when those consequences are painful." "I'm also starting volunteer work," Kyle continued. "At the youth center downtown, working with kids, trying to be a better role model than I was. And I quit the football team." That surprised Marcus. "Why?" "Because that whole culture, that whole mentality of might makes right, of dominating others, I need to get away from it. I need to figure out who I am when I'm not wearing a Letterman jacket and throwing my weight around." Marcus studied Kyle's face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation, but found only what appeared to be genuine remorse and determination. "I also wanted to ask you something," Kyle said hesitantly. "I know I have no right to ask for anything from you, but would you teach me?" "Teach you what?" "What you know, jiu-jitsu. Not so I can hurt people, but so I can understand what real strength is. So I can learn the discipline you have, the control. So I can be strong enough not to need to hurt others." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering. "My father runs a gym downtown, Rivera's MMA and Fitness. If you're serious, show up Monday evening at 6. There's a beginner's class. But understand this, if you come as a student. That means humility, respect, and hard work. That means getting tapped out by people smaller than you, weaker than you, newer than you, and accepting it as part of learning. Can you handle that? Kyle nodded immediately. After what happened in that parking lot, my ego's pretty much non-existent anyway. We'll see, Marcus said, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Over the following weeks, Westfield High School settled into a new equilibrium. The video of the fight had done more than just humble Kyle. It had fundamentally changed the school's culture around bullying. Suddenly, targeting the quiet kids didn't seem like such a safe bet. Who knew what skills they might be hiding? Who knew what training they might have? Marcus found himself in an unexpected position of influence. Younger students sought his protection and advice. Teachers who had previously ignored him now made efforts to include him in discussions and activities. Even Principal Hayes, who had walked past numerous incidents of Marcus being bullied, suddenly wanted to have a conversation about school safety and anti-bullying initiatives. "It's interesting," Marcus told the principal during their meeting, "how concerned you've become about bullying now that there's video evidence of consequences. Where was this concern when I was being harassed daily?" Principal Hayes had shifted uncomfortably in his expensive leather chair. "We weren't aware of the extent of the problem." "You walked past Kyle pouring Gatorade on my backpack," Marcus interrupted calmly. "You saw it happen and kept walking. So please don't insult both of us by pretending ignorance." The principal's face had reddened, but he couldn't deny the accusation. "Perhaps we could have been more attentive." "Perhaps. But now you have a choice. You can actually address the bullying culture at this school, or you can continue to enable it and hope there aren't more incidents that go viral, because I guarantee you, I'm not the only student here who's tired of being a victim." The conversation had ended with Principal Hayes promising comprehensive reform, though Marcus remained skeptical. Change, real change, didn't come from administrative policies. It came from individuals choosing to be better. Kyle, to his credit, seemed genuinely committed to change. He showed up at Rivera's MMA and fitness that Monday, wearing a plain white G that Roberto had lent him, looking nervous but determined. The other students, mostly adults who trained for fitness or self-defense, didn't know who he was, which allowed Kyle to start fresh. Marcus watched from the advanced class as Kyle struggled through basic movements, his face red with exertion and embarrassment as people half his size corrected his technique. But Kyle persisted, showing up 3 times a week, gradually improving, gradually understanding that real strength had nothing to do with size or natural athleticism. "Your former bully is dedicated," Roberto observed one evening, watching Kyle practice breakfalls over and over, despite the bruises forming on his back. "He's trying," Marcus acknowledged. "And you? How do you feel about him being here?" Marcus considered the question. "I feel nothing, really. No anger, no satisfaction. He's just another student trying to learn." Roberto smiled. "That's good. Holding on to anger is like gripping a hot coal. You're the one who gets burned. You defended yourself, you established boundaries, and now you're moving forward. That's true victory." Jake Morrison and Tommy Chen had different reactions to the new social order. Jake, humiliated by being choked out on camera, had doubled down on his aggressive persona, but now focused it entirely on the wrestling team. He avoided Marcus completely, sometimes literally changing direction in the hallway to avoid crossing paths. Tommy, on the other hand, had approached Marcus privately a week after the fight. "I wanted to apologize," he'd said without preamble. "I knew what we were doing was wrong. I knew it, and I went along with it anyway, because I was too much of a coward to stand up to Kyle." "You're right," Marcus had replied. "You were a coward." Tommy had flinched, but nodded. I am. But I want to be better. I've quit hanging around Kyle and Jake. I'm focusing on basketball, on my grades, on being someone my parents can actually be proud of." "Good," Marcus had said simply, and that had been the end of it. He saw no point in holding grudges against those who genuinely wanted to change. One Friday afternoon in late November, about a month after the fight, Marcus was walking to his car when he witnessed a scene that felt like déjà vu. A group of sophomore football players had cornered a thin freshman near the school's front entrance, shoving him back and forth while laughing at his attempts to retrieve his scattered homework. The freshman, Marcus could see his name tag from a distance, Alex Patterson, looked terrified but was trying to stand up for himself, much as Marcus had for months before reaching his breaking point. Marcus paused, watching, remembering his own feelings of helplessness in similar situations. Then he walked over with the same controlled confidence he'd discovered in that parking lot. "Is there a problem here?" he asked calmly. The sophomores turned to look at him, their expressions shifting from amusement to uncertainty as they recognized him. Everyone at Westfield knew who Marcus Rivera was now. The quiet kid who had destroyed Kyle Brennan. The son of a UFC champion. The one you didn't mess with. "No problem," the apparent leader said quickly, taking a step back from Alex. "We were just messing around." "It doesn't look like he's having fun," Marcus observed, nodding toward Alex, who was still gathering his scattered papers. The sophomores exchanged glances, calculating odds they didn't like. "Whatever, this is boring anyway," one muttered, and they walked away without another word. Marcus knelt down and helped Alex gather the rest of his homework, handing the papers to him with a slight smile. "You okay?" Alex nodded, his eyes wide with a mixture of relief and awe. "Thanks. I'm Alex." "Marcus. And Alex, if they bother you again, come find me. Or better yet, come to Rivera's MMA and fitness downtown. We'll teach you how to defend yourself." "Really? Really? Nobody should have to deal with that alone." As Marcus walked to his car, he reflected on how much had changed since that day in October when Kyle's group had tripped him near the stairwell. He'd discovered that strength wasn't just about knowing how to fight. It was about choosing when to fight, and more importantly, choosing what to fight for. He'd also learned that sometimes the only way to stop being a victim was to refuse to be one, regardless of the consequences. But most importantly, he'd learned that true strength meant protecting others, not just yourself. The quiet kid who had once absorbed abuse in silence had become someone others could count on for protection and justice. The mouse had indeed become the lion, but more importantly, the victim had become the protector. His phone buzzed with a text from his father. "Beginner class tonight. Your friend Kyle is getting better. Still telegraphs everything, but he's trying." Marcus smiled slightly. People could change, given the opportunity and the will. Kyle was proof of that. The boy who had made Marcus's life miserable for months was now sweating on the same mats where Marcus had learned to defend himself, learning the same lessons about humility, discipline, and control. Another text, this one from Sarah Chen. "Thank you for what you said in the cafeteria. You were right. I was a coward too. I'm trying to be better." Then one from David Kim. "Saw you help that freshman today. Thanks for being who you are." Marcus put his phone away and started his car. As he drove home, he thought about his father's words from all those years ago when he'd first started training. Violence is never the first answer, but sometimes it's the only answer that bullies understand. The key is knowing when you've crossed that line and being prepared for when you do. He'd crossed that line, shown what he was capable of, and in doing so had changed not just his own life, but the lives of others around him. The transformation was complete, but in many ways it was also just beginning. There would be other bullies, other situations requiring strength and wisdom to navigate. But now Marcus knew he had both. And more importantly, he had the courage to use them. The quiet champion had found his voice, and Westfield High School would never be the same.